Hi everyone, this is lecture 4 for invasion ecology. Today we're talking about propagule pressure and the empty niche hypothesis. So both of these are hypotheses related to why invasive species successfully establish and spread. The accompanying reading for this is Colautti et al. From 2006. A paper on propagule pressure as a null model for biological invasions. So read that in addition to watching the lecture. So again, what we're asking right now is why are invasive species able to successfully establish and spread or invade? We talked in the previous lecture and the team activity about pathways of introduction. So that's the first stage of invasion. This is now moving into sort of the second and third stages of invasion. Once a species has been introduced, how is it possible for those species to successfully colonize a new region? And so there are a lot of different hypotheses about why invasive species are potentially successful. And I'm going to cover, or we're going to cover in class, a set that are some of the more common hypotheses related to invasive species. So today we'll be talking about the first three on this list: propagule pressure, the empty niche hypothesis, and then this interaction between the empty niche hypothesis and human disturbance. And then in the next lecture, in lecture 5, we'll be talking about invasive species traits. You guys are going to be doing another team exercise related to traits of invasive species, and we'll also talk about the enemy release hypothesis. So for today, we're talking about propagule pressure. So what is propagule pressure? Propagule pressure, pretty simply, is the amount of propagules. So propagules could be seeds, they could be, if you're talking about plants, they could be plant parts that could grow and reproduce. If you're talking about insects, they could be the number of eggs or the number of larvae or whatever that come over, the number of babies of whatever that species is. And the basic idea is pretty simple, which is the more seeds, the more propagules you throw at a place, the more likely you are that one of those critters or one of those seeds is going to successfully establish. And if you throw more and more, then maybe those will successfully establish enough of a population that they can then spread and go on to become invasive. So propagule pressure, as you saw or will see in the Colautti article, is actually pretty understudied in invasion ecology. And part of the reason why is because it's really hard to study. So in order to understand propagule pressure, we would need to go back in time to the start of an invasion. And that's not where we are a lot of times with invasive species, right? We're at these end stages of invasion. So we can see an invasive species that is widespread, that is invading natural areas. And in order to understand how much of a role propagule pressure played in that invasion, we would need to go back in time to the start of those invasions. And that, without our time machines, is really challenging to do. So one of the best ways that propagule pressure has been studied is with plants specifically that are introduced or have been historically introduced as ornamental species. So here are 3 examples: Miscanthus sinensis, Celastris orbiculatus, so that's oriental bittersweet. It is getting to be this stage of fall right now, where if you look at a bunch of the trees growing probably in your yard, likely along the highways, you will see vines of oriental bittersweet draped, over and pulling down a lot of the trees. Berberis thunbergii is Japanese barberry, also an ornamental. So all 3 of these are ornamental introductions. The best way that we have to study propagule pressure has been to go back in time, sort of, in the sense that we can look at historical nursery catalogs and try to understand, okay, how many of these plants were likely introduced, how many places were they introduced to, and use that as kind of a proxy for propagule pressure for a variety of different species. So that's one way that we can do it. But generally, it's really hard to try to understand how much of this thing was historically introduced. So here's the first table from the Colautti article, and you guys are going to be going over these some more in class. And I recognize that there's a lot of information here, and this can be and is really challenging to try to understand. But this column 0 is the one that deals with propagule pressure. So the first table is talking about characteristics associated with invasiveness, that is, the qualities of the invasive species itself. And all of these numbers on here are basically the numbers of studies that Colautti was able to find that are kind of for, against, and unknown associated with those, with that particular hypothesis. So in this case, propagule pressure, in 11 studies, they found that propagule pressure was positively correlated with the establishment and spread of an invasive species. In no studies did they find that it was negatively correlated, and there was one study where there was no significant correlation between propagule pressure and the establishment of those species. So that's kind of how you read that 11-0-1. But 11-4 versus 0 against, the reason it has that little star is because that's significant. That tells us, yes, there is a relationship here. And all of these other columns, the 1 through 13, are various other hypotheses in invasion ecology. And you can see that there aren't that many stars in all of those ones that they were in this review that they did. They weren't able to find too many other hypotheses that were positively correlated with the likelihood that a species would establish and spread, or the likelihood that a species would become abundant and have impact. Then we have table 2 from Colautti, which is not focused on the traits of the invasive species, but instead focused on the susceptibility of the invaded habitat. And again, the 0 is the propagule pressure. In this case, we have a much stronger case for the establishment and spread of non-native species in an ecosystem. So if an ecosystem has received a lot of propagules of non-native species, it is much more likely to be invaded than an ecosystem that has not received lots of propagules. And not only are those non-natives likely to be established, they are also likely to become abundant and have impact. So all of this kind of tells us that propagule pressure matters. So that Colautti article is getting a little long in the tooth at this point. It's about 15 years old. So there's probably been quite a bit more research after that point. But again, that point, the propagule pressure is difficult to study, means that it remains this kind of question mark, this unknown in invasion ecology. And we have a hard time figuring out how important it is and how many propagules we need to introduce in order to increase the likelihood that an invasive species or a non-native species would then go on to become invasive. So propagule pressure matters is a good kind of take-home message on this one. The other piece that's important in Colautti's article is the idea of propagule bias. And that propagule bias could be messing with our understanding of what it means to be invasive and what's important in invasion ecology. So here are 3 pictures of some invasive species, not all invasive in the US. The top one is Japanese knotweed. Down at the bottom is ice plant, invasive in the Southwest and the coastal California. And the one in the lower right is Lantana camara, which is hugely invasive in the subtropics. So in, the South Asia, in the, basically the whole country of India has lantana that that grows over your head. So really problematic invasive shrub there. All of these species you'll notice are pretty. So these are the nice flowering pictures of these. You've probably seen Japanese knotweed flowering relatively recently around here in New England. And the point here is that people are selecting for qualities and traits that they like when they're introducing species, definitely when they're introducing species intentionally. And that those qualities, like, hey, it has a really pretty showy flower, for example, might now be associated with a lot of invasive species, but it's not necessarily a trait that is linked to invasiveness. it's a trait that's linked to us introducing lots of pretty flowering plants, and then some of those have gone on to become invasive. So our starting pool is biased, and then from that biased sample, we see a bunch of invasive species, but we don't know whether those invasive species traits are associated with, because flowering plants are more likely to become invasive, or whether they're associated with this biased sample of lots of flowering plants that we started with. So flowering plants is an easy example that we can pick out, and there might be some other things that we are creating propagule bias, some of which we can kind of try to figure out, but many of which are going to be totally unknown to us or hard to figure out for us. So intentional stuff like showy flowers, if you're introducing species for the ornamental trade, it's nice that you have a pretty species. It's nice that that species grows fast because people generally want their ornamental plants to establish quickly and not take 10 years to grow into something that's going to look nice in their yard. Broad environmental tolerance is another trait that growers tend to select for because they don't want to spend a lot of effort growing a plant that can only be grown, in a very niche market. They want it to be able to survive in lots of systems, lots of people's yards. So those might be some biases that we're introducing in terms of the intentional pathway of introduction. But then there are going to be a bunch that we're also introducing associated with the unintentional pathway of introduction. So some examples might be, if you're a plant, seed longevity, or that could be true if you're an invertebrate as well. So if your larvae can withstand a long time hanging out in that ballast water, then you're more likely to be introduced successfully into a new region. Weedy species might be another unintentional association of propagule bias. So if you are good with people, if you grow fast in these kind of disturbed environments, then you're more likely to be associated with people. Then you might also be more likely to be associated with the stuff that people are bringing with them from one place to another. But there might be, and undoubtedly there are, lots of other traits, qualities of different species. This is likely to vary by taxa. Lots of different traits that are going to similarly be biased, that some of which we may recognize, some of which we'll have a harder time recognizing. And so that can, the take home here is essentially, we need to watch out for this, because if we're not kind of paying attention to what the pool that was introduced looked like, then we might get this really, skewed, biased view of what an invasive species looks like if we're trying to identify the next generation of invasive species. All right, so that's propagule pressure and propagule bias. The next thing to talk about are these hypotheses about why invasive species succeed. So, and the next one is the empty niche hypothesis. All right, so empty niche hypothesis is the idea that an ecosystem could, and most ecosystems do, maybe all, have fewer species than they could actually support. The sort of technical way to say this is that they have lower than expected species richness. So again, species richness is the number of different species that you have within an ecosystem or a plot or wherever you're looking. So if you have fewer than those, fewer species than what you can actually support, then what that means is that you have resources that are underutilized. So if you have underutilized resources, then invasive species or any species have the opportunity to take advantage of those resources. So another way to think about empty niche is as underutilized resources. So what are some examples of resources that we might be talking about? So these are just plant-focused resources, but you could come up with a similar list if you're talking about an animal or an invertebrate or whatever it is that you're interested in. So if you're a plant, what do you need? Well, water is one important resource. Light availability is an important resource. somebody to disperse your propagules. So if you make seeds, then it's nice to have a bird to eat those seeds and move them out. Nutrients in the soil are important resources, so nitrogen and phosphorus especially, but lots of other micronutrients as well. Nice to have somebody to pollinate you. And then the lower right one is a desert system where you can see a tiny barrel cactus kind of in the bottom underneath that shrub. So it might be that you have facilitators in an ecosystem. In this case, we would call this a nurse plant, where basically the shrub is sheltering that species. But, you know, water, light, nutrients, pollination, dispersal, all important things as far as you successfully establishing and spreading in a region if you're a plant. Another way to think about this in terms of the underutilized resources is the idea of resource supply and demand, right? So if all of our resources are used, then our resource supply equals our resource usage or resource demand. And so you're on that one-to-one line where the supply is the same as the usage. There are many ecosystems in the world that are up close to that one-to-one line, right? So they've got lots of different species duking it out in these ecosystems, and they don't have all that many extra resources. And so those ones, based on the empty niche hypothesis, would be more resistant to invasion. But the ones down in the lower right have a lot of supply and not as much usage. Those are ones that would have extra resources, you know, whether it's water that's underused, whether it's nutrients that are underused. And the hypothesis is that those would be more susceptible to invasion. And just to give you guys some data, so this is back to our table 2 from the Colautti article. And this number 2 on here of what makes ecosystems susceptible to invasion, you can see that for the number 2 is the resource or food availability associated with that ecosystem. And you can see that ecosystems are more likely to have non-natives establish and spread, more likely to have non-natives become abundant and have impact if they have this higher resource or food availability. And the little star in there means that that's a significant relationship with this hypothesis. Okay, so then the question is, where are these extra resources coming from, right? Because you would think that if there's lots of extra resources, then at some point, I mean, species have been evolving for quite some time. At some point, you would think that species would have evolved to use those extra resources. So one place that extra resources come from is in space. And this is linked to the theory of island biogeography, which is a really cool idea that is well supported empirically. And the idea is that diversity in a location is a function of 2 things. First, it's a function of colonization, which adds species. And second, it's a function of extinction, which subtracts species. And so you can see on here these kind of 2 lines, right? This one is the colonization one, distance from mainland, the likelihood that you will add species. The second one is related to the island area, the likelihood that you will lose species once they've arrived. And so the idea here is that colonization, right? How hard is it to get from one place to another? So if you are coming from a mainland, you've got tons of land area, you can just kind of disperse on your own out from there, not as many barriers to dispersal, and so colonization becomes more likely. But if you're an island, there's this big barrier, right? There's an ocean between you and the nearest mainland. So if your island has just appeared, say it's a volcanic island like Hawaii or something like that, and has just emerged from the ocean, well, if you want species on your island, those species are going to have to get there somehow, right? They're going to have to have a really crazy event that blows a seed across the ocean to land in the island of Hawaii. And so the further you are from one of those mainlands, from one of these sources of seeds, the less likely you are to actually get new species to your island. And then the extinction piece says that as your island gets larger and larger, so you have more space, the larger your island, the more resources your island likely has, and therefore the more species it could potentially support, right? So even if in this freak event, you know, like a seed blows all the way out to the island of Hawaii, if that island had just emerged from the ocean, it was really small, all you've got is you know, basalt flow or something like that to land in, that's not a very great resource for a plant. And so the likelihood is, even if that plant is successfully introduced, it's not likely that it will establish and spread. So those two are these sort of counteracting hypotheses. And what they say essentially for the empty niche hypothesis is that if you are a large island that is far away from a mainland, that means that it's hard for new species to have gotten there in historical sort of evolutionary time, and you have a lot of extra resources, right? You're big, you've got palm, you know, beaches and mountains and, you know, waterfalls and whatever else your lovely island has. So lots of different places that species could potentially colonize. And so that means that if you're a large island far away, you have fewer species than you might expect because it's hard for those species to get there, and you've got lots of these extra resources. And so the result is that these large islands far away from mainlands are, based on the theory of island biogeography, they have a lot more empty niches because they have a lot more underutilized resources. So your islands are likely to fall in that kind of lower right corner where you have an excess supply relative to your usage. Your mainlands are more likely to fall closer to that one-to-one line. And it's just a note on here that, you know, we're talking about islands in the ocean, but islands could also be mountaintops. Islands could be ecosystems that are, you know, across a geographic barrier, like, you know, over a mount, sheltered by a mountain range, on the other side of, you know, anything that's hard to cross, basically. So it's not necessarily an island in the ocean. So here are just some data in terms of the successful invasion of islands. So this was looking at, from the Endangered Species Act, the number of native species that are imperiled, affected by alien species. And you can see that Hawaii, it's nearly 100% for Hawaiian birds and Hawaiian plants, versus less than 50% for continental US birds and continental US plants. And the idea here is because it's so much easier for non-native species to become invasive in Hawaii because of all of these underutilized resources, that in turn threatens native species in Hawaii much more than native species in the continental US. So that's one reason why we might have underutilized resources. Another idea on this is that extra resources can crop up in both time and space. In terms of the time, anthropogenic addition of resources is a really important one. So you've probably seen this graph at the bottom. This is not, I have not updated this recently, so it's through the early 2010s, but you know, now in you know, in 2020 we're well past 400 in terms of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So as drivers of climate change, people are introducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That has been increasing over time. And if you're a plant, remember, CO2 is one of your resources. So it turns out that when people have looked at how well invasive plants do relative to native plants, when you have rising CO2 in the atmosphere, the invasive plants tend to do much better. They are often hogs of resources. They like to grow fast and use lots of resources. So we, by adding CO2 into the atmosphere, are essentially fertilizing all plants, but definitely favoring the invasive plants. So atmospheric CO2 is one new resource that we as humans are adding. Another new resource that we as humans are adding is nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is through time. Where did nitrogen come from in soils? It came from natural nitrogen fixation, so from legumes, and it came from lightning. In the, with the green, as we started colonizing the world and growing more and more things, we started adding more legume crops and manures, which added more nitrogen. And then in the early 1900s, discovered the Haber-Bosch process to create synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and then also fossil fuel combustion. So you can see this huge ramp up in the amounts of nitrogen that are dumped, not just in farm fields, but with fossil fuel combustion globally into ecosystems. So what does that mean? Well, there are a lot of ecosystems out there with not that many resources. So take a desert, for example. So the desert is not a great example in terms of the nitrogen addition, but if you think about deserts with water, and deserts are also nitrogen poor, so they're limited. That means the thing that's limiting their growth, if you're a plant, is water, but also nutrients. So here's a saguaro cactus over time, right? At 10 years old, a saguaro peaks out around an inch tall. When it reaches 30 years old, it might get to a foot. It takes about 50 years to get to 3 feet tall. And by the time it has that kind of classic saguaro arm thing going on, it could be a couple hundred years old. So why does a cactus grow so slowly? Because there's not that much water or nutrients in the desert, right? So it has evolved for its specific ecosystem, knowing that it's going to be extremely limited by water and by nutrients, and so it's going to grow really slowly. When those nutrients are available, it'll take advantage of them, but it doesn't need them, every year, every week, every month, whatever it is. So there are lots of ecosystems like this out there in the world. Hawaii and volcanic islands are another good example of that. Those tend to be really nitrogen limited because they're volcanic islands and there's just not a lot of nitrogen in lava, as it turns out. So if you've got ecosystems out there that have these scarce resources, and we add resources, we as humans add resources to them, whether that's CO2, whether that's water, whether that's nitrogen, then we, by adding those resources, are creating underutilized resources, are creating these empty niches. All right, and then a last piece in terms of this interaction between empty niche and how they're created is the idea of disturbance, right? So we talked about us adding resources. Another way that we kind of add resources is by taking native species away, right? If you clear cut a forest, then those forest trees that you just cut down are no longer using the light resources, the water resources, the soil resources that they were using before. So by disturbing an ecosystem, we are essentially knocking down the resource usage and creating a supply for any species, but certainly for non-native and invasive species to exploit. And this is kind of a classic graph of how disturbance works, that there are these two axes of disturbance and resources. So these were plots that that they set up to disturb an ecosystem. Basically these were plant plots, disturb an ecosystem by removing native species, adding fertilizer resources on another axis, and both of those have sort of similar effects on invasion, that as you go up towards this upper right quadrant, you end up with more and more non-native invasive species, because disturbance creates resources, resources create resources, and the combination of those two is especially good for invasive species. And here's just one empirical example of disturbance versus invasive species. So cheatgrass invasion, this is a problematic species in the western US. And this graph on the right was from a paper that looked at the number of non-native and invasive species in plots that were adjacent to paved roads, slightly improved roads, but not paved graded roads and four-wheel drive tracks. And you can see that next to the paved roads, so the little A at the top means that that's significantly different from the Bs, that if you pave a road, which takes a lot of mechanical disturbance to do something like that, then you end up with a lot higher richness, so numbers of non-native species in those particular areas. So disturbance helps invasions. Good, so take-home points from this lecture. Number 4, propagule pressure, important, understudied, so we don't know how important, but propagule biases could also be skewing our understanding of invasion ecology, especially traits of invasive species. Second, empty niches and underutilized resources, 2 ways of thinking about the same thing. That empty niches are more likely on islands, and I put that in, the air quote. So island could be in the middle of the ocean, could be a sky island in the middle of a landform. And extra resources that create empty niches could also be associated with human disturbance and with the human addition of resources like nutrients and CO2 into the atmosphere. So don't forget to do the accompanying reading, Colautti et al., and I look forward to talking about this with you in class.